Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Kaczynski. The time is 5:30 a.m. on the U.S. East Coast. It is Monday, March 2nd, 2020, and you're listening to Coronavirus Central, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about this virus, all the things you don't want to know, but that the government either A, hasn't figured out or won't tell you. And we're going to have a pretty heavy show today, so we'll go through just a couple little pieces of business before we get into it. I want to thank everyone who is a part of our open source intelligent network, t.me/coronavirus central at Telegram. Special thanks to our international contingent who has done amazing work in helping get information that is not reaching the American public. We've been ahead of the curve since the beginning. A lot of it goes to them. I give them full credit, and that we are working together to understand this situation as we do every day on this show. So I want to thank them for that. Coronaviruscentral.net is the main website. If we ever get taken off Apple iTunes, which I know we have a lot of listeners on, or Twitter or anywhere else, you can always find links to where we'll be there. Given some of the information we're going to be putting out there, I remain concerned about those things. And we had a hell of a weekend, didn't we? We saw cases pop up all over the place. A lot of countries have seen the numbers double. A lot of U.S. cities are impacted. I know 12 states now are actively reporting cases. More are likely to follow in the days ahead. So there's too much content out there for me to try to cover it all, but I'm going to try to take you to the places that you absolutely need to know about, the stories that you care about, and hopefully to give you some context to better understand this disease. I spent a lot of time researching on my day off, so there's going to be some original research in the show as well, to offer some thoughts on both modeling, which I know a lot of people have asked about, and we'll talk about that, as well as the different health risks for different countries. But today's show is going to be heavily focused on North America, just for our international audience. My goal, if the news cycle allows, is to cover Europe in more detail tomorrow. It just would take 3 hours if I even tried to do it, and frankly, I don't have the bandwidth mentally to try to process as much information as I'm having, because there's just too much science I want to report on that should be relevant to everyone. So we'll definitely go there. I want to also, like I said, say thank you to everyone who was sending supportive letters and different emails, being behind this show. We really count on our community. This is becoming a full-time effort, and what you're going to see is, after this weekend, we will probably launch a Kickstarter to expand our efforts and operations, both in terms of the audio show, the quality of the content. I would love to be able to put out a second show, and if I could find someone who could do a good job on it, I'd love to do it for different regions, because we're going to need that level of local support. I mean, obviously, we hope this is a short-term project, but it's that urgent where we're going to work on it, as well as our ongoing efforts to bring research from areas of the world where things are happening to the English-speaking world primarily. So when that comes out, we hope you'll be willing to support it. What we're asking for is very modest, but we are here watching this, and we're going to give you the news you need. So today we're going to jump in, as we always do, with a quick case review of what's happening around the world. After that, there's some heavy science I'm going to get into. This stuff is very cutting edge. It's just coming out of China. We're looking at articles that haven't even been formally released for publication yet. But there's some troubling stuff, and a lot of it goes to these questions of reinfection, of chronic infection, of what is actually happening with the COVID infection. And I mean, I don't know if they're just not saying it or if they don't know, but what these research articles are suggesting is light years ahead of what the CDC is preparing you for, and we're going to talk about them yet again. And to be clear, I hate talking about the CDC because I want them to succeed, but we cannot afford as people to invest our efforts in organizations like the CDC and the WHO, who have a recurring track record of failure, not with things that, would be unknowable, but if we can figure it out with the resources of one guy sitting in his house in Maine and a number of people, sitting around their computers around the world, how the governments of the world are not able to figure this out absolutely boggles my mind, and it's incredibly concerning. We're going to talk about the case clusters that are starting to pop up other places, where the cases are starting to be spotted in the United States as well as Canada. I think we can look at these two together, and I think we ought to, at least as long as the borders remain open. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that we anticipate the reaction will start falling out. I probably won't be able to get as deeply into that as I planned, but that's okay. So, COVID19info.live. The time of this last update is 5:30 a.m. U.S. East Coast. 89,192 cases. Deaths, 3,048, 3.4. And they're listing this recovered number as 45,154 at 50.6%. And I'm going to say that is complete garbage. We're going to throw that out. Do not let yourself get tricked into believing this recovery rate, it means anything more than, I think the word we're going to end up using, frankly, for those who get infected is remission. And I know everything that implies, we'll talk about why I'm saying that in a little bit. But in terms of the international caseload, we are seeing the explosion that the mathematical model would predict. We had thought for a long time that with an R0, that's a transmission rate for those who are new to the show, somewhere between 4 and 7, that this would double somewhere between every 3 to 5 days. China is still reporting 80,026 cases. One thing I wanted to include on them is there was an article I was reading from kaixinglobal.com that was shared with me. This is from yesterday at 9:29 p.m., and China's decision to leave asymptomatic patients off corona infectious tally sparks debate. So it talks a lot about why they chose to do this, but to make it real simple for you, what that essentially does is it allows China to reduce the rate of cases by about 80%. So when they say there's 80,026 cases, in reality, if you counted asymptomatic rates, and given that the number in China has been pretty consistent, hovering around 80%, I think a more accurate accounting would be probably around 300,000 cases. And I know that changes a lot of expectations. I will share the article with you. I'm not going to go into exhaustive depth about it because it's pretty straightforward about what it reports, but it fits this tendency we've seen from the World Health Organization, where Italy is doing the same thing in a number of countries. South Korea, interestingly, is not, are choosing not to report the asymptomatic cases to keep the case count down. And it's really a mistake because it makes it really difficult to figure out where the spread is happening through. And at this point, obviously, China can't do much about it. But once again, we see accuracy in statistical reporting sacrificed at the altar of political and economic expediency. So very troubling there. South Korea continues to count the cases. 4,335 cases is confirmed with 26 deaths. A lot going on there, especially coming out of that Shincheonji church cult cluster that's out there. I read, in fact, that the government was rather mad at them. But to be fair to the church or anyone else, anywhere there's a large public gathering in a place where cases exist in numbers, that represents a potential cluster. It's something that needs to be factored into everyone's thinking now as we start looking at this. Italy utterly exploded. 1,694 cases. 34 deaths. Iran, 978 cases. That's way too low. In fact, I've been reading some anecdotal evidence that their government's having a hard time going on because one of the clusters that exist is actually in their higher government. 54 deaths reported. Diamond Princess, the cruise ship, 705 confirmed, 6 deaths. Those people are starting to be repatriated. Japan's starting to see a jump, even though they've jumped ahead of this. They shut down Tokyo Disneyland for a while. Schools are down in that country. Expect to see measures like that applied around the world. 6 cases dead. France and Germany each check in with 130 cases and 2 deaths reported in France. Singapore, a little jump to 106. Hong Kong's reporting 98. That number's not even close to reality. So we're just going to skip over that with 2 deaths. Although Hong Kong is working hard to try to contain it. I give them credit for that. United States, we're finally starting to see case reporting reveal not so much that there are new cases, but begin discovering the cases here. We're going to talk a lot about that as we go forward. 86 confirmed with 2 deaths, both in the state of Washington. One happened yesterday. I believe it was a 70-year-old man, but we'll look at the details of that. 84 cases in Spain that are reported. So as we go to other countries, Bahrain's made a nice jump to 47, Kuwait to 45, Thailand to 43, Taiwan to 41, UK's up to 36, Australia making a big jump for them, 32 with one death. Malaysia 29, Switzerland 27, Canada 24. We're going to talk a lot about Canada today. I'm very worried about Toronto. 21 from the United Arab Emirates, 19 for Iraq. A spattering across basically Europe and East Asia, and a lot of cases jumping in for the first time. Couple countries of note. I know Indonesia is now on the list. I saw there was a case that came out of there. And excuse me. So at this point, this thing's worldwide, and a lot of people were speculating that heat or other environmental conditions would suppress its spread. Not a lot of evidence to support that at this point. We'll see if it changes over time. I remember one of the early things that was said by President Trump was the thought that, the warm weathers would help suppress this. Let's hope he's right, but I don't believe that that's going to be the case based on any evidence at this point. I think that's one of those cases where our government policy planning has been based on the expectation of what other diseases have done rather than what we are actually seeing with COVID-19. And one of the things this show has speculated about that I'm going to mention again, which I think we talked about last Friday, is the idea this could be a chimerical virus. And what that means is it's basically a chimera is an organism where you have connected different parts of different organisms, and that would, as obviously seem apparent, suggest that what we're dealing with is something that's bioengineered. We have a growing series of evidentiary points to suggest that is in fact the case, and it is my personal contention that that is in fact true, that what we are dealing with this coronavirus, with COVID-19 on the SARS basis, is something that has been engineered to include different components. Now, I'm not speaking to motive, whether it was released accidentally, intentionally. I can't speak to that. People are doing research on it. More research needs to be done. But I will say that in the international literature, in China itself, there is an increasing move toward this idea that that is in fact the case, and it just hasn't been reflected yet in the policy papers and the mainstream media report in the United States, because the moment that people start getting sick and dying and someone's there to blame, the public response will be overwhelming. And I think that's what authorities seek to prevent. And researchers don't want to be the ones who go there. So we're going to go there because that's what the evidence suggests. Now, I want to start with some original research I was doing. I want to thank all the people who asked where I was on Sunday. I was trying to recover, say, a prayer or two, because Lord knows now's the time. But I was doing a lot of research about the risk profile by countries. And this is going to be a very, very brief chance to bring people up to date who are new. I want to say welcome to all of our new listeners, which I'm sure are in the great states of New York and Florida, given the cases there, as well as the Texans joining us, and all our people around the world who've been with us from the beginning. There's a lot you have to learn to get caught up to speed. Go back and start listening to the old episodes. I guarantee you it's relevant to see how things played out. But one thing we've been asking a lot of questions about is what is the actual risk to people? The basic formula we've been working on, which is derived from a lot of different research sources, but sort of hovers around a basic understanding, is what we observed in China, which is what we are basing most of this on, lab reports, is that for their series of infections in Wuhan and in China in general, before we think the data was even more doctored, is that 80% of the cases, give or take, were asymptomatic, 15% were severe, and 5% ended up being critical. And that for the 15 and 5%, medical intervention ended up being needed. Now, those numbers, given the large size of China's population, have represented the basis upon which we have thought certain areas are more or less likely to get sick, and we didn't know really what were the factors driving it. But the World Health Organization report that we talked about on Saturday identified a number of different factors, a lot of which had to do with underlying health conditions, being over, more elderly, and different certain disease factors. So we looked at as many as we could, and there were three I wanted to pull out that I think might prove relevant to a lot of our listeners. And in this study, which I published on Coronavirus Cast, and it's a quick graph, but a chart, but it's useful, I want to share this with you. We looked at 15 countries: Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Iran, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Nigeria, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And we looked at these countries to see how similar or different they were from countries where this was being heavily experienced. So we have China in here as sort of our control, okay, of what we could expect. We have Iran, Italy, and South Korea in as three countries that are experiencing heavy infection and where we recognize that there are widely divergent rates of morbidity being reported, with Iran being the highest, Italy being somewhat less so, and South Korea being a lot less so. Now, that obviously is explained by the fact that South Korea is testing proactively, which has them a couple steps ahead of the game, although we are at a point where the idea that containment and case tracing is going to work. That is to say, figuring out who got who sick by tracing who was in contact with who is out of the bag pretty much everywhere in the Western world. I mean, maybe Greenland's got a shot still, but the rest of us are in trouble. So what we discovered is we looked at 4 different factors on this. The population over the age of 65. These are, and I had to find statistics that I could do across different countries. So we know from reporting and multiple sources that those over the age of 60 are at health risk, okay? We looked at the cancer rate, and I'll give you some raw numbers, especially for those. I know our biggest listener base is in the US, Canada, and the UK, so I did a little more detailed thinking there. For diabetes, we looked at, that's definitely a risk factor, and obesity, which is a big problem. So in China, we'll just do it as percentages, that their population over 65 was 10.6%, their cancer rate was 1.5%, their diabetes rate was amongst the most elevated in the world at 9.2%, and the obesity rate was at 6.2%. So that's relatively low and manageable. So as we look at these different countries here and what's happening, what we see is, like I said, China's 10.6% of the population is over 65, 1.5% of the population is cancer, 9.2% of the population is diabetic. That's a pretty high amount, so that definitely may be a risk factor that has more relevance. And the obesity rate is only 6.2%. Another factor that I looked at broadly, that I didn't go into in depth because A, there weren't a lot of statistics available specified by country, and B, it was pretty consistent, was the prevalence of hypertension or high blood pressure. That's around 30%. It varies a little bit between 25 to 35%, with obesity being the single biggest contributor. So we're going to use that as a surrogate for this, for the purposes of our current reporting here. What I wanted to do was go a little bit further into this. So we look at different countries and what the risk factors are. And what I would say is that if we're talking about the population alone, since China only had 10% of its people over 65, the highest risk element of the population, we would expect countries with low percentages of people under that rate to maybe have a lower death and sickness rate or severe illness rate, and countries with higher elderly populations to be more disproportionately impacted. So to use an example of countries that are out there, South Korea has 14%, which is somewhat above. Iran has 6%, which is well below. So we are seeing that the age differential is perhaps not the singular thing we need to be looking at in terms of case severity. However, it is something to consider, with the United States 15.6%, Canada 16.9%, and the United Kingdom at 18%. Now, when we look at other countries that are going to be most heavily exposed, that's France, Germany, and Italy at 20.6, 21.2, and 22.7%, and Japan at 27.6%. Why do I go into all this information? Because those are the countries where being old is the single biggest risk are going to be most heavily hit. And in terms of numbers, just use the United States as an example, we're talking about 52 million Americans over the age of 65 that are in that high-risk category. That's a big number. It doesn't quite rise to the 20% we would expect to see. So part of that, and there's going to be some overlaps in this, will be covered by other factors, health risk factors. So cancer, diabetes, and obesity. And when it comes to cancer, the U.S. is number one, 5.4%, Canada at 4.6%, Australia at 3%, Japan at 3%. Most of the European countries are in the 2 ranges, and the other developing countries not so bad. When it comes to diabetes, your biggest countries are Mexico checks in at 13.5%. That's a huge number. Over 10% are the United States, India, Germany, and Brazil. China, like I said, is 9.2%, and most countries are in the 5 to 7 range. Obesity, very big risk caught up in hypertension. Number one, United States in this list of 15, 36.2%. And we have the UK, Mexico, Iran, Canada, and Australia, all the Anglosphere really over 25%. Most of Europe is between 20 and 25%. But the Asian countries, interestingly, are all under 10%. So definitely a big difference there. So that might be something that in some ways mitigates the spread of this for those countries. The purpose of this chart going forward is as we see different situations happening in other countries and we try to understand what's happening, there are 2 ways we can ask this question. The first way is there something that is happening on the ground there in terms of the environment that makes it more or less susceptible? There's actually a third way too. The second way is, does the response of the government and the authorities shape the way this works out? Obviously it does. But the third way, which we aren't hearing a lot about but will be really important for the medical research, is what does the inherent state of the health of the population portend for what we're going to experience? And to go into the 3 countries in a little more detail, that would matter to a lot of people, let's start with the United States. We have 120 million Americans who are obese by World Health Organization standards. That's usually a BPI over 25. We have 10.8% or 36 million people with diabetes, and we have 18 million people, 5.4%, who have some form of cancer. Obviously, there are going to be some overlaps in these numbers as someone could be obese and have diabetes, but let's just use the obesity number since it's the biggest. If we have in the United States already that we know 120 million people who are suffering potentially from obesity, and we have another 52 million who are over the age of 65, let's assume that the overlaps between those groups are minimal. And I can't tell you the exact numbers. I'm sure someone could figure it out. I didn't have the time to do it. But let's just use a reasonable estimate and say that at least 3/4 of the people who are in the U.S. over the age of 65 are not, in fact, obese. And that tends to be true because obesity will have you die from any number of other reasons. If that was the case, then somewhere between 150 and 160 million Americans would fall into the high-risk element of the population. That means that instead of thinking that 20% of Americans are at severe risk, which is the profile we've built from China, a country that has only 6.2% obesity and where only 10% of the population is over 65, the United States may have between 40 to 50% of its population that falls into the World Health Organization's listed groups of people who are at higher risk. What does that mean for this disease? It means that it may end up being far more deadly or severe here, that the stress on the health system will be far greater, and this is one more source of concern, which is why I did this research. For Canada, you're talking about a population of 38 million people approximately. Up there in the Great White North, we have about 6.5 million people over the age of 65, 17%. Obesity rate, a little over 11 million. So let's do ahead, combine those by the same formula we use for the United States, and you end up with a number approximately in the neighborhood of 16 to 17 million people in a 38 million person population. A little bit better than the U.S., but you're still pushing up against about 40% risk factor. Once again, very high. United Kingdom, cancer rates a little lower, diabetes lower. 18% are older, that's 12 million in a population that's estimated just shy of 68 million. And we have nearly 19 million people who are obese. So let's do the math. Let's see, that's 18, and we'll call it 8. So that's 26. About a third of the United Kingdom would be, a little over a third of the United Kingdom would be high risk according to these factors. And so what I'm suggesting to you is a theory that we can watch as this goes forward, is that those countries that have more advanced healthcare systems that are responsible for maintaining people who have pre-existing conditions will be more at risk as we go forward, based upon the initial research about who is most susceptible. And we could go ahead and test this, and for medical researchers who are listening and using this show to maybe guide some thoughts on where to go, it would be really interesting to see if we could link up the number of cases that are connected to individual conditions. And as we look through some of the science on this, perhaps it will become easier to see what that's out there. Now, we're going to consult this chart a lot more for the European cases as well next episode. But what I would note is I've had a lot of people ask me about, do I think the developing world will get hit as hard? And I'll just use one example. Nigeria, a country of 210 million people in West Africa, their obesity rate is only 9%. They only have 3%, 2.6% of their population over the age of 65. And in terms of the extended analysis, because they don't have a medical system that's as effective to begin with, their relative fall will probably be less traumatizing. Will there be a lot of death and suffering? You would think. But that in a lot of ways, this is a disease that is, I hate to say it, a first world problem in a lot of ways. And we're going to see this really pound Europe, Japan, and the North American continent, and anywhere where obesity is up. So that's going to be a real problem for Mexico. It is a big problem in Iran, and it's going to be a big problem for Australia as well. And I don't know New Zealand's numbers, but I would imagine they're probably similar. So I want to go ahead and go forward back to the cases. This has been a tough show for me today. I mean, I was looking at this, my heart was kind of beating because there's a lot of stuff in here. The next two articles I'm going to read are scary. There's no way to go around it. I'm going to read them, annotize them a little bit, but we are getting some really interesting research out of China that scares the hell out of me, and we'll see at where this leads. I don't want to put too much weight on anything off early research, but if the things I'm reading are true, it really changes how we have to approach this whole disease worldwide, and especially in terms of how we as individuals act in the United States. I posted on Twitter at CoronavirusCast before I came on that I was going to redouble my efforts to encourage people to quarantine and avoid contracting this disease at all costs. And I know that's very hard because people have to work. Also because we don't know who has it or how long it's been out there. These are things that trouble me deeply. Nonetheless, we need to look at the evidence, look at the risks, and value public health above economics here. And you need to do this, or it may not matter later. And I'll tell you why I say that. So the first article we're going to share is from globaltimes.cn, Chinese source here. And it goes, autopsies offer key clues for early stage COVID-19 patients. This is by Long Shu Mi and Xiao Yu Shu. Published on February 29th at, it looks like about 12:30 in the morning. Autopsies show severe damage to COVID-19 patients' lung and immune system, according to a doctor in Wuhan reached by the Global Times who called for measures to prevent fibrosis of the lungs at an early stage of the disease. The influence of COVID-19 on the human body is like a combination of SARS and AIDS, as it damages both the lungs and the immune systems. Peng Zhiyong, director of the intensive care unit at the Shangnan Hospital of Wuhan University in Wuhan, told the Global Times on Friday. Let's just take one step here. Yeah, I mentioned AIDS there, and this fits what we saw with the evidence. This fits the original research that came out of India that was suppressed on January 30th. This fits the article that we shared late last week from the South China Morning Post, where there is an increasing understanding that there is an HIV element to this. We see it genomically in the spike protein by which the entrance to the upper respiratory system happens. And now we see in autopsies a third data point of how this is happening. So, and we're getting SARS, that's the pneumonia part, that's the hemorrhaging part. But we're getting AIDS too, in the sense that it is having a similar impact where we don't know the long-term consequences of this, where it is actively suppressing the immune system. Really bad news. All right. Peng said he had just talked to Liu Long, a forensic specialist from the Tongji Medical College at Huazhong University of Science and Technology. Liu's team has reportedly conducted 9 autopsies on deceased COVID-19 patients as of February 24th. And I wonder if this isn't behind the silencing behind the Great Firewall of China. The autopsy results Liu shared inspired me a lot. Based upon the results, I think the most important thing now is to take measures at an early stage of the disease to protect patients' lungs from irreversible fibrosis. That's a hardening of the lungs where they don't function properly anymore, or tissue, I should say. It could be anywhere, but in this case, we're talking about the lungs. If irreversible damage is done, other measures like those to prevent patients from oxygen deficit will not be of much use, he said. Liu's team published a paper on the autopsy they conducted in the Journal of Forensic Medicine on Tuesday. The paper said there was apparent damage to the patient's lungs and excess production of mucus spilled out of the alveoli, indicating that COVID-19 causes an inflammation that damages deep airways and pulmonary alveoli. That's the air sacs in the lungs. We talked about ground glass opacity. And what they're saying is that the immune system is being suppressed. At the same time, this disease is affecting you. You know, some people have talked about a biphasic disease. So what might be happening? That while the SARS is waiting to deliver the pneumonia mode, the AIDS is breaking down the immune system. And, obviously AIDS is a development. In the same way that AIDS comes out of HIV, you would say COVID comes out of SARS-2 and SARS-2-CoV. Okay, or SARS-CoV-2. Said that backwards. My apologies. All right, the patient, an 85-year-old man, exhibited similar pathological changes to those caused by SARS and MERS. Fibrosis in his lungs was not as serious as those seen in SARS patients, but an exudative reaction was more apparent, possibly due to the short course of his disease. News about the paper went viral on social media platforms on Friday. And this is what they're talking about in China. And I want to thank our sources in Asia. You know who you are, who helped provide this. Really appreciate you sharing this with us. Some news reports said that Liu's team's autopsy showed that sputum bolt is one of the main reasons that cause COVID-19 patients' deaths. Some medical staff have used aspirators for patients based on the results, which led to a decline by half the number of deaths in Wuhan on Wednesday. So that's good news that we're gaining better understanding, that we need suppressive drugs for HIV like Trifanavir, I think is the name of the one, which will, looks like they're starting to test, as well as, making sure that the lungs are not overwhelmed at this time. All right, the National Health Commission said Wuhan reported 42 deaths on Tuesday, 19 on Wednesday. However, Peng doubted the reports, saying he believes the decline was due to an improving situation and shrinking patients pool. We'll skip parts of this because the number of deaths is very dependent there on what's happening with the politics. So the patient mentioned in the paper was hospitalized in January for a cerebral infraction, the death of tissue in the brain resulting from an inadequate blood supply. He was confirmed to be infected with novel coronavirus 13 days later and died after a further 15 days. The autopsy was conducted within 12 hours of his death. No apparent pathological changes were found in his digestive system, spleen, or brain, the report said. The first autopsy was conducted on February 16th, about a month after the outbreak. And he had, Liu previously told the media that he and his team had proposed to the Wuhan government to conduct autopsies soon after the outbreak. The government and local hospitals agreed on the necessity of autopsies, but could not provide proper locations. They also worried about the risks of viral transmission during such autopsies. Yang Zhongku, Deputy Director of the Pathogen Biology Department at Wuhan University, explained that preparation and risk of the autopsy of COVID-19 patients is crucial, as it may cause containment of the hospital or medical members. Also, Chinese traditional thoughts of preserving the body of the deceased may hinder the autopsy process, which requires family consent, Yang told the Global Times. Well, I bet they found plenty of people who had no one to volunteer for them. But so this article, why is it so important? What it's telling us is that we have a two-phase disease that really has a lot of different issues going on with it, and that as we go through this, one of the other things that's going to become clear for this is that we do not know what COVID is precisely. It is more than it seems to be, and the efforts to prevent panic by presenting a minimal form of the disease that is based on one level, governmental desires to protect people from a panic, but secondly, and reasonably, I would argue, the thoughts of researchers that this is a natural disease that should follow natural patterns of what we observed before, we are now seeing a rising number of data points that suggest that this is not behaving like things we've seen before, which also, I think, creates a stronger circumstantial case. This is not zoonotic, other than in the sense that was the base of it, but rather that this is something that was artificially created. And if, in fact, that was true, then a lot of our assumptions, just like we've seen with the 14-day quarantine periods, have to be thrown out, and we have to proceed on an evidence-based approach to understanding this so that we go ahead and protect ourselves from what this is, not what we expect it to be. We have continued and made so many mistakes because we've made optimistic assumptions about what this is, and public health now requires the government to come clean and assume the worst-case scenario, as Senator Tom Cotton has done very well, and too few people, sadly, have been willing to do. And I know there are medical researchers who disagree with me about this, but we're making the case one point at a time. It does not seem like a random act of evolution to me that you would affix HIV to AIDS to SARS and then say, oh yeah, that came out of bat droppings. That does not strike me as probable, and in terms of any scientific analysis, that would not make sense given that these places exist in different areas, and we're talking about in HIV something that has never been connected to coronaviruses before. Okay, so the next article continues in a somewhat similar but equally interesting vein, and this is going to be from the Journal of Medical Virology. This is an accepted article. It has not been peer-reviewed yet, so we're jumping it. This is from February 27th, 2020, and it's called "The Neuroinvasive Potential of SARS-CoV-2 May Be At Least Partially Responsible for the Respiratory Failure of COVID-19 Patients." And I'm going to take the time to read this article. It's not super long. It's about 3 pages. But I think it's important enough that I'm taking your time, and I appreciate you giving me the time to do this. If this show has to run long for you to know things you need to know, I'm going to take the time, and you can listen to it in parts, because I try to keep it to an hour to an hour and a half. Today's not that day. Sorry. So this is, and these are from more Chinese medical researchers working as well with the Brain Science Institute in Japan. So the sources are from the China Academy of Chinese Medical Science in Beijing, and the Riken Brain Science Institute in Saitama, Japan, Yan Chao Li being the primary author. Abstract. Following the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, SARS-CoV, which I'm just going to call SARS to make this go faster, and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome coronavirus, MERS-CoV, we're going to call that MERS, another highly pathogenic coronavirus named SARS-CoV-2, and that's COVID. We're just going to call it that to make it easier. Emerged in December 19 in Wuhan, China, and rapidly spreads around the world. This virus shares highly homological sequence with SARS and causes acute, highly lethal pneumonia as part of COVID-19 with clinical symptoms similar to those reported for SARS and MERS. The most characteristic symptom of COVID patients is respiratory distress, and most of the patients admitted to intensive care could not breathe spontaneously. Additionally, some COVID patients showed neurologic signs such as headache, nausea, and vomiting. Increasing evidence shows that coronaviruses are not always confined to the respiratory tract and that they may also invade the central nervous system, inducing neurological disease. What's that saying there? This thing can get in your brain. That's a big jump, and it's a big problem. The infection of SARS has been reported in the brains of both patients and experimental animals, where the brain stem was highly infected. Furthermore, some coronaviruses have been demonstrated able to spread via a synapse-connected route to the medullary cardiorespiratory center from the mechano and chemoreceptors in the lung and lower respiratory airways. What it's saying is that it gets into your nervous system through your lungs and works its way up to the brain. In light of the high similarity between SARS and COVID, it is quite likely that the potential invasion of COVID is partially responsible for the acute respiratory failure of COVID patients. Awareness of this will have important guiding significance for the prevention and treatment of COVID-induced respiratory failure. So what they're saying in this, and I'll read in more detail, but if I give you the preview, it will help. They're suggesting that what COVID may do is it may act like SARS to infect the brain, such that the brain basically loses the ability to breathe. Forgets is perhaps not the quite right way to put it, but that with the interference in the neurological function of the brain, the autonomic nervous system would be affected in such a way, and God knows, I can go deeper into medicine than I'm comfortable with, but essentially that you have the unthinking part of the nervous system affected in a way that might cause the lungs to forget to breathe. And that's very concerning beyond any sort of neurological damage, because I am not aware of any tomography, MRIs, anything like that that's out there about what's happening to people's brains. I wish we would find some. We are chasing that actively. All right. So let's go through the article. Coronaviruses, which are large, enveloped, non-segmented, positive-sense RNA viruses, generally cause enteric and respiratory diseases in animals and humans. Most human coronaviruses, long list of examples, cause mild respiratory diseases, but the worldwide spread of two previously unrecognized coronaviruses in SARS and MERS has called global attention to the lethal potential of human coronaviruses. MERS is still not eliminated from the world. Another highly pathogenic coronavirus, currently named COVID, emerged in December 2019. This novel coronavirus has caused a national outbreak of severe pneumonia in China and rapidly spreads around the world. Genomic analysis, that's looking at the genes of it, that COVID is in the same beta coronavirus clade, that's grouping, as MERS and SARS, and shares highly homological sequence with SARS. That's why it was named SARS-2 by the Virology Institute, even though they didn't want to call it that because COVID was deemed to be more politically palatable. The public evidence shows that COVID shares similar pathogenesis with pneumonia induced by SARS or MERS. That's how it enters into your body. Moreover, the entry of COVID into human host cells has been identified to use the same receptor as SARS, and that's that ACE2 receptor we've talked about at some length. It's just a way that it gets into your body. It's a protein that regulates the constriction of blood pressure in arteries and veins, as well as other functions. And if it's not properly regulated, you have fibrosis, which is to say a hardening of blood vessels that leads to snappage, breakage, potentially hemorrhages, and just one more of the wonderful, pleasant things from this disease. Most coronaviruses share similar viral structure and infection pathway, and therefore the infection mechanisms previously found for other coronaviruses may also be applicable for COVID. A growing body of evidence shows that neurotropism is one common feature of coronaviruses. Therefore, it is urgent to make clear whether COVID can gain access to the central nervous system and induce neuronal injury, that's hurting your neurons, your nerve cells, leading to the acute respiratory distress. And ARDS has been one of the big things that has been killing people in Wuhan that we've been very concerned about. And this also, if we connect this with the article we had just read about the autopsies, we see the same thing. And in the World Health Organization reporting, acute respiratory distress is happening. And part of that could be that there is a neurological component to this, where the brain in function in conjunction with the lungs or other organs, we don't know if it is or is not, but with this we know, at least with the lungs, is being hindered in some way. COVID causes highly acute, highly lethal pneumonia with clinical symptoms similar to those reported for SARS and MERS. Imaging examination revealed that most patients with fever, dry cough, and dyspnea show bilateral ground glass opacities on chest CT scans. That just means difficulty of breathing, by the way. However, different from SARS, COVID-infected patients rarely showed prominent upper respiratory tract signs and symptoms, indicating that the target cells of COVID may be located in the lower airway, although we've seen some respiratory issues as well, where it has like a light influenza development. And keep in mind as we go through this, the geography of your own body is very important. Where the infection starts from, just like we're seeing with these clusters, is where we would expect it to see it spread. So if you have a respiratory infection in your upper body, it's going to get to your head faster That's why you have headaches and a head cold and all those unpleasantries. But one of the big things that the body does to protect itself is there's something called the blood-brain barrier, where the blood that circulates the body has to go through an extensive series of filters to enter into the brain. And the reason being why is because your brain is trying to insulate itself from being infected from any disease, because neurons in general are highly appealing to a number of different pathogens. The axial code, for instance, for a lot of people who have immunosuppressive disease, like unfortunately my wife has, you find that it's a site that a lot of bacteria and viruses actually love to feast upon, and that's why the brain goes so far to protect itself, because once you start having neurological disorders, you have all sorts of functioning errors. It's like if you had a car and the steering wheel didn't work. That's why you want to avoid neurological disorders, because you don't know where you're going to drive to. But that's why you want to protect the brain, and why diseases that do not cross the blood-brain barrier are seen in many ways as having a level of severity that is less complex than what you would see with something that does cross the blood-brain barrier. And we haven't talked about that at all in this research, but now we're covering it a little bit because this article is leading us there, which maybe offers an answer to, at least a beginning of a pathway to a question we've been asking on this show for 3 weeks now, which is that why are people who are well, who are testing well, who get 2 tests and are told they're okay, get shown as reinfected? And if it's in the neurological system and we're testing in other systems, that would explain why. Because once something gets in there, across the blood-brain barrier, it is very difficult to see it removed. And that's why you see people who have things like Alzheimer's or ALDS or any of those lupus, MS, chronic Lyme. They have a real hard time getting rid of it, because you kind of can't without screwing over the body. And that really is a troubling thing, because does the recurrence come from within the body, or do we have this HIV-related illness potentially running roughshod over our nervous system? We don't know, and the research is really frightening. All right, so we're going to continue. Based upon the first-hand evidence from Wuhan local hospitals, the common symptoms of COVID were fever, dry cough, and onset of illness. However, the most characteristic symptom of patients is respiratory distress at 55%. Among the patients with dyspnea, more than half needed intensive care. That's really troubling, because we've talked about one of our big concerns is the number of ICU beds that are available. And I hope and pray, and if anyone in Washington is listening and is trying to solve some things, you better start planning for bigger ICU numbers based on everything we are telling you. About 46 to 65% of the patients in the intensive care worsened in a short period of time and died due to respiratory failure. Among the 36 cases in intensive care reported by Wang et al., 11% received high-flow oxygen therapy, 41.7% received non-invasive ventilation, and 47.2% received invasive ventilators. These data suggest that about 89% of patients in need of intensive care could not breathe spontaneously. Very scary number there. It is now known that coronaviruses are not always confined to the respiratory tract, and they may also invade the central nervous system, inducing neurological diseases. Such neuroinvasive propensity of coronaviruses has been documented for almost all the beta coronaviruses, of which COVID's in that class, including SARS, MERS, and then they have another of other ones, including mouse hepatitis, porcine. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but there's a number of viruses in different animals that show this can happen. In light of the high similarity between SARS and COVID, it is quite likely that the potential neuroinvasion of COVID plays an important role in the acute respiratory failure of COVID patients. According to the complaints of a survivor, the medical graduate student, 24 years old, from Wuhan University, she must stay awake and breathe consciously and actively during the intensive care. She said if she fell asleep, she might die because she had lost her natural breath. This is a really huge data point. I have not heard this anywhere here before, but what might be happening, and for medical people who are listening to this, practitioners, you may need to keep people alert in the same way, how like if some people have a concussion, you don't want to let them go to sleep because they lose access, the blood loss causes functioning in the brain to not inform the body. It may be that part of the treatment protocol, which is suggested by this data point, we'll get more, it's coming, is that you have to keep the people who are under oxygen therapy alert, because if they forget to breathe, if they're not breathing actively, you know how we breathe when we're not thinking about it, because if we didn't, we'd die. Well, they don't. But you can override that with thinking, and that's really going to be a big part of this for people who are in severe situations, and how we have to handle that in the treatment protocols is something that really needs to be further developed. Okay. It is believed that the tissue distributions of host receptors are generally consistent with the tropisms of viruses. The entry of SARS into human host cells is mediated mainly by cellular receptor angiotensin converting enzyme 2, ACE2, which we've talked about a lot on this show, which is expressed in human airway epithelia, lung parenchyma, vascular endothelia, kidney cells, and small intestinal cells. So it's talking about different tissues it's in and organs. Different from SARS, MERS enters human host cells mainly through dipeptidyl peptidase 4, DPP4, which is present in the lower respiratory tract, kidney, small intestine, liver, and the cells of the immune system. However, the presence of ACE2 or DPP4 is not sufficient to make host cells susceptible to infection. For example, some ACE2 expressing endothelial cells and human intestinal cell lines fail to be infected by SARS, while some cells without a detectable expression level of ACE2, such as hepatocytes, I think those are blood cells if I'm not mistaken, or maybe that's lymph, could also be infected by SARS. Likewise, the infection of SARS or MERS was also reported in the central nervous system, where the expression of ACE2 or DDP4 is very low under normal conditions. And so what this is saying, just so you understand, is that if it uses ACE2 or DDP4 as the primary pathways, which we saw with SARS or we saw with MERS respectively, it doesn't get into the central nervous system as much, because the problem is those are not in the central nervous system. But this is where the HIV component perhaps connects, that gets this into the central nervous system, so that you have an approach where you have one part of this virus is suppressing the nervous system response, at the same time the other one's causing you to have pneumonia. And maybe it could be that the secret is COVID is killing people because it's making them forget to breathe at a time that they can't get away with it, because their oxygenation level is so low. We don't know. It's interesting. Early in 2002-2003, studies of the samples from SARS patients have demonstrated the presence of SARS particles in the brain, where they were located almost exclusively in the neurons. Experimental studies using transgenic mice further revealed that either SARS or MERS, when given intranasally through the nose, could enter the brain, possibly through the olfactory nerves, and thereafter rapidly spread to some specific brain areas, including the thalamus and the brainstem. It is noteworthy that in the mice infected with low inoculum doses, MERS virus particles were detected only in the brain but not in the lung, which indicates the infection in CNS was more important for the high mortality rate observed in the infected mice. Among the involved brain areas, the brainstem has been demonstrated to be heavily infected by SARS or MERS. The exact route by which SARS or MERS enters the central nervous system is still not reported. However, the hematogenous or lymphatic route seems impossible, especially in the early stage of infection, since almost no virus particle was detected in the non-neuronal cells in the infected brain areas. On the other hand, increasing evidence shows that coronaviruses may first invade peripheral nerve terminals and then gain access to the CNS via a synapse-connected route. The transsynaptic transfer has been well documented for other coronaviruses, such as HEV67 and avian bronchitis virus. Okay, so that's word soup. Here's what it's saying. This virus comes in through the upper respiratory system through peripheral nerves. Could be the ocular nerve. It could be, in this case, they're talking about olfactory. Those are nerves in your nose. So you sniff it in, right? And it's coming into the brain, and what could happen, and this might explain why we see all those videos coming out of not just China, but also Iran now, where people just fall over. What we could be seeing, and some of them seem to get up, some of them don't, but what happens is maybe there's a brain interruption happening there where they forget to breathe, and when you forget to breathe, you have a lack of oxygen, your body doesn't have fuel. It does the same thing a car does without gas. It stops. The body stops, and the natural response of the body to stopping is you faint, you fall over, and whether that ends up being permanent in terms of a stroke or you end up having something that's less severe where, that jolt reawakens the nervous system for whatever reason. I don't know, but that could be an explanation that fits this growing evidence we have here of how this is happening. And so that brings up one really important point that I would make for a couple reasons, which is the advice by the former Surgeon General to say don't wear masks is absolutely asinine. There's no other way to say it. I understand the government's trying to protect medical practitioners, I agree, but this growing evidence now suggests that wearing a mask is even more important than ever, because if in fact it is the upper respiratory infection through these secondary nerve actors that is causing brain damage such that it is exacerbating this pneumonia or causing other impacts that lead to severe injury or death, you need to prevent that. And a mask does that. It does a couple things. One, it does that. Two, it provides a basic level of protection. And three, which I had a neurosurgeon explain to me as a basic thing, but it's really true, is it prevents you from touching your mouth and nose all the time, which honestly we all do. I think the average person does it like 100 times an hour, some ridiculous amount of times. And if you count yourself, you'll see you love to flick the ends of your eyes, your nose. We don't want to do that now because you might be spreading something to yourself. You do not want this. We don't know what it is. We know it's bad. Okay, so let's see where we were. HEV67N is the first coronavirus to have found to invade the porcine, that's pig, brain, and it shares 91% homology with another coronavirus, HCOV OC43. And we're just going through some of these other ones so that we can understand and compare mechanisms by which this could operate as a means to begin our research. I mean, we got to make jumps here. We're going to have to work quick. This is why you have a historian serving as your medical researcher, because when life's on the line, you can become an expert on a lot of things quick, right? HIV first oronasally infects the nasal mucosa, tonsil, lung, and small intestine and suckling piglets, and then is delivered retrogradely, that's after the fact, via peripheral nerves to the medullary neurons in charge of peristaltic function of the digestive tract, resulting in so-called vomiting diseases. So it's saying that it's messing with the part of your brain that handles digestion, and since your body isn't getting signals from the brain, it sort of short circuits because it isn't getting the right electrical signal, and you end up having these, quote, vomiting diseases. The transfer of HEV67N between neurons has been demonstrated by previous ultrastructural studies to use the clathrin-coating mediated endoexocytotic pathway. Yeah, don't know. Similarly, the transsynaptic transfer has been reported for avian bronchitis virus. Intranasal inoculation in mice with avian influenza virus was reported to cause neural infection besides bronchitis or pneumonia. So they're saying that when they infected the mice with the avian flu, what ended up happening was that the brain got hurt besides pneumonia. So this is really interesting, right? So this is a flu-like element that exists beyond potentially what we saw with HIV, but not beyond what we've been saying with Chimera, which is this idea that we now have the flu, HIV, SARS, and I've talked about some of the other things, dengue fever potentially, the what's it called, flavivirus tendency of antibody-dependent enhancement. Who knows what the hell happened? It seems like these people, and whoever put this together, one head took a damn blender, put every awful disease in it, and said, ooh, let's see what we can make. This is crazy. And I can only hope that the hybridity of it maybe presents some weaknesses by which we can treat this, because if we don't, we're in big trouble, people. All right, let's see. Of interest, viral antigens have been detected in the brainstem where the infected regions have included the nucleus of the solitary tract and the nucleus ambiguous. The nucleus of the solitary tract receives sensory information from the mechano and chemoreceptors in the lung and respiratory tracts, while the efferent fibers from the nucleus ambiguous and the nucleus of the solitary tract provide innervation to smooth airway, smooth muscle, glands, and blood vessels. Such neuroanatomic interconnections indicate that the death of infected animals or patients may be due to the dysfunction of the cardiorespiratory center in the brainstem. So, what are they saying? That the part of the brain that tells it to breathe forgets and the animals die. Taken together, the neuroinvasive property has demonstrated as a common feature of coronaviruses. In light of the high similarity between SARS and COVID, it is quite likely that COVID also possesses a similar potential. Based on an epidemiological survey on COVID, the median time from first symptom to dyspnea was 5 days, to hospital admission was 7 days, and to intensive care was 8 days. Therefore, the latency period is enough for the viruses to enter and destroy the medullary neurons. As a matter of fact, it has been reported that some patients infected with COVID did show neurological signs such as headache, nausea, and vomiting. So what are they saying? That we have this period that we've been looking at as an incubation period of 7 to 9 days to the amount of time where the pneumonia hits. But what could be happening is during that period of long asymptomatic development, or where people are not out there, that the virus is trying to gain access to the brain as part of a preemptive attack. Like, it'd be like if you had a castle and you were trying to have someone sneak in the gates to open the gate before the virus came in there, but where that gate represents your memory of breathing. That is what they're saying could be happening here, and that there's evidence based both on other diseases that have been tested in the coronavirus family and the beta coronaviruses, as well as what we are observing based upon symptomatic reporting of patients, and now what we are potentially seeing with the autopsy reports. So we're starting to have a lot of evidence for this, and I know I don't like to go usually an hour into the science, but I think this is important enough where you will indulge me, and I'll give an hour over to the news too. This is a long podcast. It's the way it is. You are listening to Coronavirus Central, your one-stop shop for the apocalypse. Enjoy learning, right? All right. The implications of potential neuroinvasion for COVID. As an emerging virus, no effective treatment has been developed for the disease resulting from COVID. Therefore, awareness of the possible entry of COVID into the central nervous system will have important guiding significance for prevention and treatment, including NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. You need to be wearing masks. I'm sorry, everyone needs to be wearing masks. Go panic. Now's the time. Get it. If the neuroinvasion of COVID does take a part in the development of respiratory failure in COVID patients, the precaution with masks will absolutely be the most effective measure to protect the possible entry of the virus into the central nervous system. It may also be expected that the symptoms of patients infected via fecal, spelled differently, oral or conjunctival route, that's eyes, will be lighter than those infected intranasally. So what does that mean? You want to protect your eyes because the optic nerve is the fastest way to the brain, and you want to protect your mouth. So get goggles, no openings on the sides. At least have some glasses to provide some protection. Something is always better than nothing. Don't forsake the good for the perfect, especially since you guys are late to the party. If you haven't started already, that's fine. But it's never too late to be smart, and it's never, when you see the asteroid coming, you run the other direction, right? The possible neuroinvasion of COVID may also partially explain why some patients developed respiratory failure and while others did not. It is very possible that most of the persons in Wuhan who were first exposed to this previously unknown virus did not have any protective measure, so the critical patients is much more in Wuhan than other cities in China. That might explain a lot, and I think that's really important. And what are we doing? We have our damn government out there saying, well, no, you don't need masks. This is criminal negligence, and I tell you what, we should have, when this is all done, a mass liability suit against our own government for how poor the advice has been top to bottom. This is a systemic failure where their desire to emphasize, economic well-being over public health and safety, it was just obvious pragmatic responses. It's been so imbalanced, and it's been so negligent. And I'm not saying that they're saying this because they don't believe what they say. I'm saying they're not doing their damn research. How is it that they don't know this? Unless we're going to learn more bad news with this stupid thing. Considering the possible neuroinvasion of COVID, antiviral therapy should be carried out as early as possible to block its entry into the central nervous system. Airway inhalation of antiviral agents will be the first choice at the early stage of infection, which will inhibit the replication COVID in the respiratory tract in the lung and prevent from its subsequent neuroinvasion. It is also urgent to find effective antiviral drugs that can cross the blood-brain barrier. I agree with that. Moreover, corticosteroids, which are used frequently for severe patients, may have no treatment effect but rather accelerate the replication of the virus within neurons. Here's where things are going to get real complicated for the researchers, and we talked about this with vaccines, that if this virus has multiple different vectors of attack, and we're treating it for one level, is that exacerbating other levels? And honestly, there's no way we're going to figure this out until we put pieces together, and we're going to make cocktails for some people that are going to get hurt. This is a problem. For the very sick, you do what you can, but I had said throughout this that you have to treat the HIV, but is that going to cause other problems because of these other features? I don't even know. And of course, it's far beyond one person to say we're going to need a lot of lab reports, but in the time we're waiting to do something, we need to have optimal prevention measures. And I would just say, based upon what we're learning here, we need to be moving towards quarantines much faster. And an external quarantine to hold people in isn't going to work at this point. You got to hold yourself out. And if you don't do that, man, you're taking your life in your own hands. Because, look, I've read, I didn't want to say literally dozens of papers on this. We just don't know what it is, and I got to shoot straight with you. I don't know either, but everything I see, every time I assume a worst-case scenario, I learn some new thing that shouldn't be possible. The first assumption we have to make with COVID is to not make any of our old assumptions. This is not SARS, this is not MERS, this is not the bird flu, this is not Ebola, this is not a hoax. This is reality coming down on us like a ton of bricks, and people are at risk from things we don't even know. We know some of the things that will get us, we don't know everything. This Swiss Army knife likes to cut like crazy because it is a highly infective, highly transmissible virus that is becoming endemic in the population. And I worry about long-term measures, and I worry about those people who we are saying are safe. Are we really? We just don't know. And that's a really bad place to be. Concluding paragraph. Since COVID may conceal itself in the neurons from the immune recognition, complete clearance of the virus may not be guaranteed even the patients have recovered from the acute infection. We've seen this. In support of this, there is evidence that COVID is still detectable in some patients during the convalescent period. Therefore, given the probable neuroinvasion, the risk of COVID infection may be currently underestimated. Well, how's that for understatement, right? So, these two articles, in sum, which we spent an hour reviewing, change the game in both how we have to treat this and what we have to worry about. We have to worry about long-term impacts of how this has impacted us. We have to begin adopting universal mask usage. And, I'm glad to hear the government has 43 million masks, as President Trump reported with Secretary Azar. What is that going to do for the other 290 million people? Not to mention the fact you can't use these every day. If you can go out there, if you're listening to this podcast and you're serious about survival, you're getting the damn masks and you're not going out there because we don't know how wide the spread is. We're going to get into some questions of that. We're going to talk about the CDC. And I'll tell you the truth, I had a really hard time even starting this show today. I've been sick to my stomach. I've been sick to my heart. I woke up at 4:30 in the morning and I read this 3 times before I read it on air because when this was shared with me, and I received this particular article at 2 a.m. this evening, thanks to our Asian source, and I want to thank him. You keep staying lucky, man. And this is from the Journal of Medical Virology by Yan Chao Li, and we're coupling that with the also autopsy piece from Global Times. But there's other pieces out there. We need to go ahead and expand this. What the government absolutely needs to do, and if they're not doing it, is get some more researchers on these items and start working on this. And I don't know what the hell they're doing. So we're going to talk about the CDC, and I'm just going to lambaste them because they can't do crap right. That's literally what they stand for at this point. And I can only assume, people ask me, why are they so bad at this? I assume one of 3 things is true. And they're all terrible. Number one is they're that inept, and don't undercount this. Bureaucrats, especially at the higher levels in complex organizations, often don't know what's happening at the ground, and there's a lot of levels and layers of bureaucracy. Governments are designed to act slowly. They're super tankers, right? They carry a lot of load with them, and when they read something wrong, they crash into the iceberg like the Titanic. It's no accident we see all sorts of governments with all sorts of ideologies in all parts of the world having a lot of problems with this because they are not structured or intended to deal with problems, to deal with rapid change. Government does not do this well. It's just a reality of it. The second possibility is that they are competent, but their research is just wrong. Given the language barrier that we've talked about, given that a lot of these pieces that I'm giving you that are cutting edge are not in the mainstream media yet, they're only coming out of China, they're not peer-reviewed, and you're not going to see people touch this from respectable organizations, they may very well be running behind. I hope that the assets of the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and whatnot are being heavily devoted towards converting some of this and learning what's happening, as well as research they should be doing on their own based on autopsies and whatnot, whether that's publicly or privately transmitted. It would be better if it's public. This needs to be an open source project. I totally believe that because open source is better at finding problems and assessing bugs. The guesses they get wrong result in people dying. And that number, given the progression rate that we're seeing a doubling on average every 3 to 5 days, is not something we can continue to contemplate with countries now in 3 and 4 digit reported test amounts. And those numbers probably honestly reflect a smaller amount. I think the South Korean number, and we're going to check that right now because I think South Korea is the one country that's doing this right, and this update now is as of 6:50 a.m. on the East Coast. They're reporting in South Korea 4,335 cases, but they've also tested about 40,000 people. Last I saw, that number may be higher. I don't have the most recent one, and that number may be incorrect, but I know they were at least at 35,000 at the rate they were going. They should be about there. So they're finding 1 in 10 people have this. That's not good. Not good at all because, the testing does have problems. We've talked about that. Let's talk about the CDC. And I'm going to just scan over these because I just don't have the heart to go into the detail of everything they do wrong. But Axios is reporting, this is updated as of, what's it, 2 minutes ago, but it would have been around 6 because of what I put it on there. Scoop, lab for coronavirus test kits may have been contaminated. And we'll just read the high things. A top federal scientist sounded the alarm about what he feared was contamination in the Atlanta lab, that's the center of the CDC, where the government made test kits for the coronavirus, according to sources familiar with the situation. The Trump administration has ordered an independent investigation of the CDC and prevention lab, and manufacturing of the virus test kits has been moved, sources said. Why it matters. At the time, the administration is under scrutiny for its early preparation for the viruses. The potential problems at the lab became a top internal priority for some officials, but the Trump administration did not publicly talk about the Food and Drug Administration's specific concerns about that Atlanta lab. Senior officials are still not saying what the FDA regulator found at the Atlanta lab. The CDC lab in Atlanta developed a testing formula for the coronavirus test, which the government says works and was manufactured in relatively small amounts of testing kits for laboratories around the country. This is where the lab ran into problems, said sources familiar with the situation. So they go through a lot of things asking about whether or not they can be corrected, that they have higher confidence, they're looking into it, and what concerns they have. It's a good article worth reading. It's just in the interest of time, I'm going to skim over it for you. I would say this, too, and look, a lot of people are making this partisan, saying it's Trump's administration. Look, these are professional bureaucrats at the CDC who have been there their whole life. They would be here if Obama was in there, if Hillary had won, Trump. This is not an issue for political ideology, and people scoring points off this should be ashamed of themselves. What this is a bureaucratic failure of leadership within the institution itself of our bureaucracy within the CDC. And I would say, as I've been observing this, and we'll have a piece in a minute about this, I think the FDA has acted very responsibly, very intelligently, and I want to give credit to the Food and Drug Administration. In fact, I'll tell you why. We'll move a piece forward here. The Food and Drug Administration released on February 29th an updated new policy to help expedite availability of diagnostics. When this thing got away from the CDC in terms of which labs could put out there, because they had only allowed 3 labs and they were making all sources go through, the FDA jumped in there and they wanted to go ahead and be sure to allow local testing, which is in fact what I think has driven this effort to go ahead and report these new cases. As scary as those numbers are, this is good information and we want more information because we can't do any mathematical modeling or have an understanding of the challenge before us before we have some reasonable statistical model of what this COVID outbreak in the U.S. looks like. I had suggested online yesterday on my Twitter account that I think it would be good if the United States picked a city of representative size of maybe 10, 20,000 people that's in an near urban, suburban environment and test everyone, maybe in New Jersey or, somewhere in California, to get a feel for how many people actually have this so we can have a mathematical model predict what's happening rather than trying to estimate where cases are, because the truth is we don't know. People were coming in from China with this as early as January. There are these extended incubation rates. There's a lot of reasons why we have no idea what's out there. And at this point, all we can do and all this podcast can do beyond admitting this problem is suggest how to remedy that problem, which it says to grab a sizable statistical sample that might be indicative, perhaps from different regions. That should be within the government's capacity. And also to go ahead and in terms of what we are suggesting, we will have to work cluster from cluster, assuming that the appearance of a cluster of cases is indicative of a much larger amount. We'll get into the math of how I want to talk about that in a minute. But I do want to give the FDA some credit for a news release they put out there here. Today, as part of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's ongoing and aggressive commitment to address the coronavirus outbreak, which they have done as they have been looking at where the shortages are. Good job, FDA. The agency issued a new policy for certain laboratories seeking to develop diagnostic tests for coronavirus in order to achieve more rapid testing capacity in the U.S. Quote, "We believe this policy strikes the right balance during this public health emergency," said FDA Commissioner Stephen M. Hahn, MD. "We will continue to help ensure sound science prior to clinical testing and follow up with a critical independent review from the FDA while quickly expanding testing capacities in the United States. We are not changing our standards for issuing emergency use authorizations. This action today reflects our public health commitment to addressing critical public health needs and rapidly responding and adapting to this dynamic and evolving situation." So that's good news, and I would say that that's happening. I think also, to be fair, I know a lot of people are not fans of Vice President Mike Pence. There's a lot of controversy about how things were handled in Indiana, but one thing that he said that I think is crucial to this we should all support, which is that beyond partisanship, beyond party, and beyond levels of government, we need active integration where state, local, and federal officials are working on this. And frankly, given the number of people required and given the limitations of what the federal government can do in terms of personnel, I think we need to invert how this is happening. We need to empower people at the local level to act on this, just like we have done with this open source intelligence network, to provide information at times weeks ahead of where the media and the public administration is, and use the federal government to do what it does well, which is gather resources and mass production of those goods, items, services, and awareness that's needed for mass consumption. Let the information flow out of the local area. We'll bubble it up and send down all the resources from the top to bottom. Look, the government is a hammer, okay? But the nail we need to do is mask production, medicine production, antibiotic production. And if there are mass, compiling functions that the government does well at the higher level, let's do that. Let's bring in private partners, whatever we have to do, medical researchers. This is time for like Marshall Plan level thinking. We need to begin deputizing medical researchers to get them on board, and we cannot keep pretending this is just the flu. God, I'm so frustrated with that. You can hear it in my voice, I hope. So the CDC. Let's have another case. This one really got me. All right. One other thing first. So one piece of good news that fits this from CNBC.com. From Lauren Thomas, published Sunday, March 1st, 9:58 a.m. More than 15,000 coronavirus test kits are on the way to health professionals, Mike Pence said. That's good news. That fits the FDA. The FDA's approved the testing regimen that state and local officials are using. He said the government is working with another commercial provider to send another 50,000 kits out. I think that's very good news as well. So we definitely want to do that. We have presence in a number of cities across the country where if someone presents at a hospital with respiratory airway, we want them tested for coronavirus. We're going to have a lot of volume, and they're talking about the numbers here, that they're working with 3M to get a large number out. A lot of those need to go to people as well. It's time for us to begin working on this. We understand now, we have some research to suggest this is a key element of stopping this virus, is protecting the upper respiratory system, specifically olfactory and optic nerves. It's not the fans, conjunctive nerves. Those are the nerves right around the eyes that are serving as the means by which we are having brain infection. That we have enough evidence now, I think, to begin acting on that. I'm glad this is happening, and I want to add one other piece. I was going to put this at the end, but it seems to fit here. This is from sciencemag.org. Singapore claims first use of antibody tests to track coronavirus infections. This is really big news. I'm just going to read 2 or 3 paragraphs of this, and then I'll let you read about what happens here. This is by Dennis Normiel, February 27th. In what appears to be a first, disease trackers in Singapore have used an experimental antibody test for COVID-19 to confirm that a suspected patient was infected with the coronavirus. The patient was one of 2 people who together formed a missing link between 2 clusters of cases that each occurred in a Singapore church. Researchers around the world are racing to develop antibody tests, also called serological tests, that can confirm whether someone was infected even after their immune system has cleared the virus that causes COVID-19. That's SARS-2. The group that developed the test at Duke Medical Center in Singapore is among the front runners, although its assay has to be validated before it is taken into production and developed widely. Current tests for COVID, I should say SARS-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, look for genetic material of the virus, for instance, in saliva, nasal, oral, or anal swabs using the polymerase chain reaction. They have one huge drawback. They can only give a positive result when the virus is still present. And I would add to that, if it's now we know that it could be hiding in the neurological system. And for people who have testing for neurological diseases, something my wife and I have dealt with in our life many times, as people, as my wife is affected with Lyme, I will tell you that those sort of things are harder to find, and the false occurrence rate jumps through the roof with tests like that. Not surprising if we have a neurological component. This explains why the PCR testing has been so poor beyond the systemic failures, that the nature of what it's looking for is wrong. Maybe the serology report, which looking for antibodies, may offer a better way of identifying who's been sick that hopefully could be faster as well. I don't know that, but hopefully this offers another option for a way we can get something out that's more useful. So the test can't identify people who went through an infection, recovered, and cleaned from their bodies. But what this does, and it talks about the serology of it as we go further here, it allows the ability to see not only who has it, but who would have it. So I would add one more paragraph. Serological assays need to be carefully validated to make sure they react reliably, but only to antibodies against the novel virus, said Bart Hagmans of Erasmus Medical Center, whose group is working on the test itself in collaboration with Utrecht University. Indeed, one concern with the similarities between viruses that cause SARS and COVID may lead to cross-reactivity, Wang said, but the newly developed test can distinguish the two viruses with high accuracy and confidence. Good. Good. To our friends at the CDC, look into this. Start doing your damn job. Either that or start sending me a much bigger check. Not that the money's going to mean anything the way we're going. Okay, so I want to get back into the order of cases. So we're going to get into the case stories now. We're at 1 hour 20. You're listening to Coronavirus Central, news after the tone. Ding! Okay. This is from San Antonio Express News, and Sig Christensen wrote this March 1st, 2020. CDC, coronavirus patient released in San Antonio later turned up positive. An evacuee from Wuhan, China, who had been in isolation at a San Antonio health facility, was released over the weekend, but then turned up positive for coronavirus after having had contact with the public, possibly exposing them, the San Antonio Express News has learned. The CDC said Sunday that the patient met the criteria for release, including 2 negative test results, and left the facility on Saturday. Well, we've been screaming at them that that's not good enough. That patient was later returned to isolation after pending subsequent lab tests came up positive for the virus that causes COVID-19. This is the 5th case we've pointed out of this. I'm sure there are many more. We were talking about in Israel, Japan, South Korea, China. We've seen this all over the place. And now we have a mechanism. Maybe it's hiding in the neurological system. We don't know. That's one possibility. There are others we haven't even considered. Just assume because you solve one problem, it's not the only way this does it. It's weird. The patient was a woman and in contact with about a dozen people at a hotel. Bexar County Judge Nelson Wolf said the discharged patient had some contact with others while out of isolation, and CDC and local public health partners are following up to trace possible exposures and notify them of their potential risk. So I had predicted, and I had said that this was something that I expected there were going to be problems in places where people were taken. We said, and you can go check me on this, around the middle of last week, that there were going to be issues around Sacramento, where Travis Air Force Base was, San Diego, where Miramar Marine Corps Air Station is, where Lackland Air Force Base, in San Antonio, Texas, and potentially out of Omaha, where there were a whole bunch of people brought there. This is the fulfillment of that prediction, because the CDC has not only are their quarantines not working, which we reported on in the story in the Washington Post, of containing for the people they know are sick, which should be pretty much low-hanging fruit, but their very criteria by which they're judging this are wrong. So what would we suggest is a better criteria? That you need to keep these people in isolation for at least 30 days, and that we need to probably wait until there's better testing, and I would suggest the serological test. Now, what I suspect we're going to find is that, in fact, this does not go away, especially for people who have it severely, and that creates a whole new different set of problems, because we're going to end up, if that's true, with classes of people, those who have this and those who don't, and how you separate them may be a very difficult problem that will lead to a lot of other issues. It's not lost on me that civil conflict between the sick and the unsick may become an issue at some point. And the way we prevent this from doing so is by minimizing the spread now, using masks, and taking whatever protective actions you can do to not get out there and not get this. Because if you get this, it's going to be bad, and we don't know how bad. And I'm not saying it can't be cured. I don't want to say that because I don't know that. But we know a vaccine is at least a year away in best case scenario. And given the complex nature of what this disease is, and that, it defies all assumptions, including the wrong one that was made that men are not stupid enough to do something like this, which I think now we've had ample evidence of the stupidity of governments that we can begin questioning that. We need to be smart. And at this point, the goal of this podcast, we said in the first episode when I had that long paragraph I wrote that I used to read at the beginning of the show, is that we want to protect you, we want to protect families, we want to protect public health, we want to protect physicians and nurses and everyone, even the people who are doing such a poor job. But I'm sure they're trying hard. And look, I take a lot of shots at the failures of the institution, not because of I wish to attack the people, but because of frustration at the consequences of failure. We need our best to the front, I said this on my Saturday show. I mean, I don't care what you believe, man. I'll sit there and all of us need to come together across language barriers, across national barriers. Governments need to stop playing for competitive advantage and economic jockeying and managing the market so that we don't have it go down too much. We need to solve this virus. This is a threat to the human race. That's it. And we don't know what it's going to do, We don't know if it's going to turn brains to mush. I don't know. And I'm not saying this to scare you. It's scary, but I'm saying it because we don't know, and we can't make assumptions anymore. We got to chase the evidence fast. And everyone has to be on deck. You should be working as hard at this as I am, because this is your family's health. This is your health. This is not something to joke about. You think you get over it, and I think we're supposed to think that. I think that, the kid's not getting sick. Thank God for that. But is that so that we don't trace this as fast as we can? Well, this is spreading like wildfire. I don't know. I'm worried. I'm really worried. Okay, so we talked about the CDC and their problems in that San Antonio Express article. And what we're going to say, this piece is from the New York Times, another good piece by Sherry Fink and Mike Baker. And this will be the preview to the section about sequencing. Coronavirus may have spread in the U.S. for weeks, gene sequencing suggests. The two cases detected weeks apart in Washington state had genetic links, suggesting that many more people in the area may be infected. This makes a lot of sense to me. I thought that we would be dealing with a situation where, frankly, as of late January, I was predicting, and I was wrong, at least in terms of what we observed, but that we would have millions of cases worldwide in February, because that's what the math suggested. And there were a lot of things that intervened with that, borders and barriers and travel bans, which probably reduced that rate. But the number of people who have this, based on the mathematical modeling we were looking at in January, based on the number of people who left China, would be huge. I'm not going to try to work out the numbers for you. I'm just going to say that it's had a lot of time. And I'm going to take one moment to go into mathematical modeling just for a second so that everything we read after this makes a lot more sense. And I'm doing this really super stupid simple, and I've come up with what we're going to call Tom's formula for the number of cases that exist in a given area. Absent quarantines or other measures that have been widespread predicted, the case total in a given area is greater than 20 times the number of revealed cases. And I want to explain how I created that formula. That we know for every case that's symptomatic that there's an average of 4 cases that are not symptomatic. So there would literally be 5 times the number of cases as there are revealed cases. We also know there is a delay in rate between the time that people start showing the most common elements of the disease, the pneumonia and whatnot, at 7 to 9 days, that bring people into the hospital, even though they do have fever, cough, and sometimes respiratory difficulties and these other symptoms as early as day 2 or 3. But the average, we'll use the median just to make it easy, is about 8 days. So during that time, if we assume, which I think is a reasonable assumption based on what we're seeing worldwide, that the doubling rate runs roughly every 4 days, call it 3, call it 5, call it what you want, then we know that this case number that we are seeing today of cases that are manifest by the severe conditions where they're being caught in a system that is only testing severe cases probably represents 2 generations removed from the number of cases that have already begun and that are at the beginning of their asymptomatic incubation phase. So what does that mean? That if we see 10 cases, okay, that are manifest in a given area, that there would be at least 50 cases that are likely spawning that, and that there are as many as 200 people infected because you go back 2 different generations. That the doubling going back 4 days is 100, going back 8 days to people who are just getting infected and have no signs of sickness, including on testing, because the virus hasn't replicated, you're at 200. So it's a real simple math equation, and it's really simple. The number may be bigger than this, and maybe a lot bigger than this, especially because this does not factor existing cases we are not aware about from earlier spreads of transmission. But Tom's law, which we're going to use for this show's analysis until I have evidence for something better, is that the case total is 20 times the number of revealed cases in an area. And I just did real quick math off the back of the envelope to give you a feel. So if there's 10 cases in an area that are reported, expect there are 200 cases in reality. If there are 50 cases in an area, 1,000 in reality. If there's a 500 in an area, 10,000 in reality. Very simple math equation. The virology and the epidemiology of this is far more complex, but I am giving you short workarounds in the same way that Newton kind of shortened certain equations to tell you how gravity worked. It's not exact because it doesn't show the mass between 2 different bodies, which you factor in there. But once you treat that as a constant, you can kind of create something you can use that is easy enough to understand and helpful. So this is the number we're going to use for presumption of what's happening. And that's why, as we talk about this cluster in Washington and other clusters, I am looking actively for clusters because that's where the problems are biggest. And I would say that the one thing that will change this equation is when the government starts doing better testing that captures a large number of asymptomatic cases, which we are not doing to the best of my knowledge at this point. But South Korea is doing. What you may see is that a change in that rate because, for instance, South Korea is testing huge swaths of people to find needles in haystacks, whereas we're waiting until we get pricked to be like, oh, I shouldn't jump in there. Different approach. I don't know what we can do in terms of logistics, but it's something to think about. All right, so back to the case from New York Times. Researchers who have examined the genomes of 2 coronaviruses and infections in Washington state say the similarities between the cases suggest that the virus may have been spreading in the state for weeks. Washington had the United States' first confirmed case of coronavirus, announced by the CDC on January 20th. Based on an analysis of the virus's genetic sequence, another case that surfaced in that state and was announced on Friday probably descended from the first case. Once again, another quarantine failure. The 2 people live in the same county but are not known to have had contact with one another. And the second case occurred well after the first, but no longer be expected to be contagious. That's an assumption that's probably wrong. So the genetic findings suggest that the virus has been spreading through other people in the community for close to 6 weeks, according to one of the scientists who compared the sequences, Trevor Bedford, an associate professor at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and the University of Washington. Dr. Bedford said it was possible the 2 cases could be unrelated and had been introduced separately into the United States, but he said it was unlikely because both viruses contained a genetic variation that appears to be rare, which was only found in 2 of the 59 samples whose sequences have been shared from China, where the virus originated. So I'm just going to take one step back to do an assumption here, and we're going to look at this caseload using Tom's law, right, that we got in here and see how this works out. And what I wanted to take a peek at real fast here is that if we had one case going back to January 2nd using this law, what would we have in terms of our expected outputs? Okay, so if we apply Tom's law, which is suggesting that the case that's revealed is reflective to a number of 20 or more, and just saying, and we're applying these 2 basic tenets and using this, we're assuming that the case that was found on January 20th, which would have spread before then, because let's say that the person got infected before isolation, but roughly, it doesn't matter, it's 42 days, and we assume a case doubling rate, which is an assumption, but it fits the facts as well as anything as we've seen, that the cases double based on every, 4 days, that we're dealing with, we'll use a number of 40 days to be conservative, okay? Because it's probably higher than that. If the case doubled every 4 days, and if the person in Washington infected just one other person who went untraced, that would suggest that based on mathematical modeling, 5,120 people at a minimum are infected in Washington with coronavirus. And of the 5,120 people, we would expect in terms of the number that are symptomatic, if this model is close to accurate, that number to be somewhere around 200, close to 300. And of course, this is all estimation, where there's a lot of different pieces. So, don't shoot the messenger. And these things may be being treated wrongly. So, will we see a spike soon? I think so. Are there dangers in these assumptions? Yeah, but I put them up front so you know that. So, I want you to know the numbers are going to be big. Don't be scared. Be scared. But, the problem is that this spread is endemic at this point, and you're not going to trace that many people. I was going to talk a lot about quarantines today. We probably won't get to it. But if it's coming, look where the cases were early, given the lack of containment, it's going to be there. And we'll talk about those clusters. We'll talk about Washington. So, a scientist who was not involved, this is back to the New York Times article, in the analysis said he agreed with the conclusion the second case was connected to the original Washington case. I think he's right, said Andrew Rambeau, the professor of molecular evolution at the University of Edinburgh, referring to Dr. Bedford. It's extremely unlikely that two viruses coming from outside America would arrive in the same geographical area and be genetically related unless they were connected. And so they were talking about CDC using that quarantine, or the criteria that you had to get only people who had traveled to China or been within 14 days of a known coronavirus case. If the virus has been spreading undetected in Washington since mid-January, that could mean anywhere from 150 to 1,500 people may have it, with about 300 to 500 people, the most likely range, said Dr. Mike Familiar, principal research scientist at the Institute for Disease Modeling in Bellevue, Washington, who performed the analysis. These people have either been infected or recovered or currently are infected right now. They are assuming a much lower and slower transmission rate than I am, but that's still a huge number. And ultimately, the only question with these rates, and I don't want to focus too much on the modeling, I get asked a lot about this. Suffice it to say this, whether this rolls like a slow wave, like a storm on the horizon, which in some ways, frankly, is worse than seeing it come quick, just from someone who's watching it, or if it ends up being quicker, like I'm suggesting, you're going to have a big number. And, the modeling, a little bit of change in the presumptions of the virulence of this has a very big difference. So even though you see these numbers that are very big in difference, it's like the difference of if you multiply 2 times itself over it again and 3 versus itself, you'll notice there's that exponential split between there. That's why these numbers are all over the place. But he said Dr. Familiar's estimate was based on a simulation using what scientists have learned about the incubation period and transmissibility of the virus. He called his figures a best guess with broad uncertainty. Another method based on the size of local population, number of tests performed, and the proportion of those who were positive, produced similar estimates of how widely the virus may be spread in the community. Those are reasonable estimates. I don't have an issue with them. They're conservative, but I can see why governments need to be more conservative than I'm being. So they said they had a bunch of doctors saying these different things. They did say the first patient, a man treated in his 30s, has recovered after being treated in a hospital isolation unit. The later patient, a teenager, had mild enough illness to recuperate at home. Did they go home? Did they keep spreading it? We don't know. They don't know. They thought they didn't, but they didn't know the disease, so who knows what's true. So a lot of more detail about the cases that came in here. It's a good article. Sherry Fink actually won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on that, has an MD and PhD. Good work there. Let's keep up the work and share that. So I want to share these. Now we're going to go into the updates portion of the show. We're about, looks like an hour 36 in here at this point. My apologies, we're running long today. There's a lot of information. I cut out what I could. There's just too much, and we needed to talk about the medicine. I think you'll agree. And if you don't split it up into 2 parts, you can have this, get your lunch, and have indigestion afterwards, right? All right, 10 coronavirus cases, 2 deaths confirmed in King County. And this is in the Seattle area of Washington. Update, Public Health. Seattle and King County announced on Sunday afternoon 4 additional confirmed cases of COVID-19 in King County residents, including 1 death, bringing the total confirmed cases to 10. Today's results include an additional death, bringing the total number of deaths to King County to 2. The 4 new cases are a woman in her 80s, a woman in her 90s, a man in his 70s, and a man in his 70s. All of them have underlying health conditions, so not surprising that they would be some of the first people to go down. Question I'm wondering is if you have the one of the key elements is that there is a sort of time sequence where the COVID infection is trying to crack the safe of the neurological system before it infects the body. Could that be why we see people who have comorbidities, pre-existing conditions, poor health, getting sick faster? And could it be that the infection rate at which COVID proceeds is directly contingent upon the health of the victim who contracts this? I don't know if anyone's asking that question, because we're looking at cases that are asymptomatic, thinking they're recovered, but what if they're not recovered and it's just taking longer for the symptoms to manifest? Maybe that's a fear that's legitimate, maybe it isn't. It's just thinking aloud. It's a question I have. 4 other cases reported by public health include a woman in her 50s who traveled to South Korea recovering at home, a woman in her 70s who was a resident of Life Care hospitalized at Evergreen Health, a woman in her 40s employed by Life Care who's at Overlake Medical Center, and a man in his 50s who was hospitalized and died at Evergreen Health. That must be that first case. Possible outbreak at the Kirkland Nursing Home and the Life Care Nursing Home. There were 110 residents, 180 Life Care employees. They also say 25 firefighters and 2 officers are being quarantined. And this is why I keep saying that we can't go ahead and have our solution to finding cases be we shut down everyone around them in quarantine. That ship has sailed. We need to go ahead and take proactive, not reactive measures, and begin getting masks on people and putting mass production. And if we have to shut down the whole damn country, you know what we should say? Take a week, get as much food to everyone, and shut the damn thing down. I said that last week. It would have saved lives. It would have saved a lot of things, and no one's going to listen until it's too late. It's annoying. Right, virus spreading for weeks. They referenced the New York Times article, How to Protect Yourself. We've talked about that. So stay home when sick, practice excellent hygiene habits. Yeah, clean yourself, don't go out, wear a damn mask. Okay, 10 cases there. That's a cluster. Keep an eye on Seattle. It's going to be a problem area. Be one of the places that gets government intervention first. And whatever policy they come up with, they're going to try there. Hopefully it's a good one. Los Angeles Times were reporting, here's where coronaviruses have been reported in California. This is from yesterday, Dr. Alex Wigglesworth, just Alex Wigglesworth, and Sumya Karlamangla. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Cases of novel coronavirus have begun to amount in the U.S., expected to grow. In California, at least 40 cases have been reported. 24 cases were people who caught the virus on the Diamond Princess cruise ship or in Wuhan, where it was first reported. An additional 16 cases were returning travelers, or in at least 5 cases now, people who contracted the virus in their community. It seems to be coming heavily out of Solano County, California, between Sacramento and San Francisco. There's a case now in Alameda County at the North Bay Vaca Valley Hospital. A healthcare worker there, which suggests someone came in who was sick, maybe had something else, whether it was the person who had, who was being treated for this, or someone who was disconnected. But we see that. We have a case in Humboldt County, California, and I don't know the geography of this as well, but for the people who are out there, this will be useful to you. Now it's February 19th. We have a case now in Los Angeles. LA County officials announced that on January 26th. Let's use the same modeling model. If you use my modeling model, you probably have 2,500 cases in LA, roughly. If you use a more conservative model, that's probably about 500 cases. They were quarantined for 14 days and have been released, said LA County Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer. So, that guy's a problem. More than 50 people came into contact with the patients, many of whom were health workers and identified at risk and asked to limit contact with others. Some are still under those precautions. Orange County, California, case on January 25th. They declared a local health emergency on February 26th. Maybe they know more than we do. Once again, you're going to expect, several hundred cases at a minimum, and the number may be higher than that. Sacramento County, San Benito County, just read through these, San Diego County. 2 cases have been reported in San Diego County, both of them among people who were evacuated by Wuhan and Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. The first patient was mistakenly discharged from the hospital on February 9th. You'll remember that story. We reported that. And sent back to the base after a mix-up with the latest results, and was returned to the hospital the following day for care. Health emergency declared February 14th. Yeah, that's out in the public. There's your San Diego cases that are there. They'll start showing soon. Santa Clara County, we're talking about Silicon Valley. Some testing happened there. People from Wuhan, Shanghai. And a third case is believed to have contracted in the community, made public to Thursday. The patient's an older woman with chronic health conditions hospitalized for respiratory illness. She had no known exposure to the virus through travel or close contact with a known infected person, and the fourth case was connected to her. The fifth, sixth, and seventh cases came on Sunday. So Santa Clara County, which is just, if I'm not mistaken, just south, I think that's around like San Jose and whatnot, that's going to be a cluster. Let's keep a close eye on that. That's going to be a big problem. The San Francisco area is going to be a problem. And I think the government at this point, if they were going to do something... See, the problem, I feel for the government a little bit, because if they had acted proactively like they needed to do, like Singapore did, like South Korea's trying to do, they could have done a lot more. And what would have happened is a whole bunch of people would have went out there and said, you're doing all these things and there's no evidence. Do not wait for the evidence to catch up with you. Do not wait for the bullet to go through your body to be sure you're going to bleed out. Go ahead and put on that bulletproof vest. Is it getting to me? It sounds like it's getting to me, right? So there's another cluster I want to share. These are for our friends up in Canada. This is from CBC News. This is updated as of 7 hours ago. From Toronto, Ontario confirms 4 new positive cases of coronavirus, bringing the provincial total to 15. Health officials have confirmed 4 new cases of coronavirus in Ontario, involving 3 men and 1 woman. The men are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, while the women are in their 70s. 3 of the latest cases are in the York region, that's Toronto suburbs, and 1 is in Toronto. The other confirmation comes a day after 3 positive cases were confirmed in the province, 1 also in the York region. And they relate it to, they say, quote, the regional medical officer said, this is related to travel to Iran. We have a case that came in from Egypt that they traced back that came to Canada, 1 that came from Iran, and 1 that came from South Korea, which shows that there is worldwide transmission happening that is very clear across different things, well beyond the most stringent travel bans. We need to shut down travel across borders now. In fact, we needed to do it yesterday, but that's not going to happen. For Canada, I'm particularly worried because they have a high Iranian population in Ontario specifically. Also, Montreal may be affected. I think Ottawa and Windsor will be another place. So I've had some listeners in Michigan asking, why aren't we getting infected? Yeah, it's coming across the bridge there from, and it'll probably come into Detroit through there. And to be fair, it might come another way because there's cases in Chicago as well. I just want you to know that these are out there. So, and of course, they have, how is the WHO combating coronavirus misinformation? Yeah, by putting out their own lies. This thing talks about a lot of the people where they came from Egypt, from different things. I'm going to skip all that in the interest of just speeding up. For those who are looking, it's a good article, but I would say we should expect that there's going to be a lot of case spread coming in Canada, specifically in Ontario. And, for all the conversation about shutting the southern border, honestly, Canada's probably a bigger threat of infecting the United States. Based upon the virology, based upon who moves where, and the fact that people don't flee to Mexico, whereas there was a very large contingent of Chinese people who would have fled to Vancouver, and that they probably brought it with them. Now, the only good news in all of this, while we're all sitting here, we're all panicking together, right? Because we should be prepared, and I prepared, and hopefully you prepared, but if you didn't prepare, it's not too late to do some smart things, and a lot of us may still be able to protect ourselves if we act in our own interest now and not wait for the government to tell us what to do. You're going to have to take choices now that are unpleasant, and decide quickly. But what we can do is we can suspect that, Vancouver would have gotten a lot because a lot of Chinese people came in there. And I know a lot of people were concerned at the beginning of not signaling because they didn't want to look racist. Look, this is not a question of racism. This is a question of virology and disease. Everyone can get sick from this. But we have to be smart about who has it, where they're coming from, and separating ourselves from them until we know what this is. Because until we know that some people are immune or we have some treatment protocol that works, that is practicable, we now have something that is an unknown pathogen, essentially, that's infecting a whole lot of people and that's causing a lot of problems. So the time for political posturing is over. And I think in Canada, man, I would just suspect that they have a huge case rate in Vancouver. And I would think, we're going to go now to New York. I know the first case is in Manhattan. I was watching those videos. You can find them online, like in Flushing, where they were in these Asian markets. And you could see all the people were rushing to just grab everything and to go lock themselves at home. Or there's these great videos of Costco's all around the country where people are going. And I think that reflects that there's a series of anecdotal conversations happening between people in certain ethnic communities back home that they're not being transmitted publicly that reflect that there is far greater concern, and that I think China has done the world an incredible disservice by promoting this idea of calm and not having issues, if in fact that these problems we see are as bad as we think they are. And the fact that they continue to further clamp down and tighten on their media restrictions, and it's just made it pretty much impossible to get anything other than a little bit of medical research out of there, has been one of the more disgusting parts of this effort. And I understand why they do it. I understand why politicians do a lot of things. I was one, and I got punished for it. But ultimately, this is a time for truth and transparency. Let's get past the games. Let's focus on survival. So this update was from 6:30. It's updated as of 6:36. And let me see if I can even update it more, because I will do it. All right, 6:36 a.m. CBS News reporting. And this is going to we're going to go through this fast, different places where people are sick here. Saying there's at least 89 confirmed cases in the U.S. so far. The number of cases in Italy jumped to 1,377. South Korea, 476 new cases. Head of South Korean sect apologizes for its role in virus spread. And we are now reporting, let's see, in this, there were, I don't know where it went. I saw it before. It said there were 12 different states now that were reporting. Oregon and Rhode Island both announced second presumptive cases. We haven't talked about the Rhode Island cluster at all. That is one that's growing. We got a teenager at home with mild symptoms. Good for them for testing. There was a trip that went to St. Raphael Academy. They're tracing that back through. Florida has 2 presumptive cases. A lot of people were talking about that there was a public health emergency being declared by Governor DeSantis. One in Hillsborough County, I believe that's Tampa, and Manatee County, I think that was Sarasota. I might be wrong about that, but that ultimately we have several people quarantined in Nebraska set to depart on Monday. Don't you want to know where those people are going? Typhoid Marys, right? And I feel bad. I don't want to make light of it, but honestly, we know these are issues. So we have also from last night, the first case reported in New York State. There's a woman in Manhattan who has this. Look, she was the unlucky person to be the first person tested. This is in New York. It has to be. Given that everyone travels there, and I know we have a lot of listeners in New York City, New Jersey, Connecticut, the Northeastern Corridor. A lot of my friends are in Boston. This is going to be widespread there. You guys need to act quick. What are you going to do? Protect yourself however you can. Emphasize more fully the need to protect your breathing, to not expose yourself more than necessary. Let's hope the aerosolized spread is minimal. There's a lot of arguments being made that is not as present as it seemed on the Diamond Princess because of the fact that there was such poor quarantine there. There is some evidence that the quarantine was terrible, which doesn't necessarily invalidate if this is aerosol spread, but we know that we have the issues with droplets. So wear a mask, be careful. If you're having to go out in public areas, if you're in New York and anywhere with a subway system, the subway in New York, the T, or in Boston, the L in Chicago, BART in San Francisco, avoid public transit if you can. Ask to telecommute. Take sick leave, because I am anticipating, based on what we are learning, by 2 weeks from now, and I've been saying this for a little while, and I think maybe even a week from now, we may see a lot of shutdowns happening. So what should you be doing if you're going out? Now is the time to stock up with the idea you're going to be home for a while. Because if you're one of those people going out, you're taking 2 different risks. 1, the disease. 2, 3 risks. The disease, the safety risks, and the fact that you're going to have the food scarcity risks. And I think a lot of law enforcement personnel and a lot of health responders, given that our government failed to protect them, and we tried with this podcast, man. I put out a petition, I talked to people, I put out local newspapers, and people don't want to talk to me because I'm the guy that talks about nature even when it's unpleasant. But they're listening now, and you guys are too, and thank you for that. I appreciate all of our listeners, and you make this show possible. We'll be counting on your support, and we're going to count on you to make this bigger and better and stronger so we can figure out the answers are to this and try to make sure there's some people to take advantage of all this research, rather than a whole bunch of people getting ill with things that are going to be chronic illnesses, potentially, and whose severity and virulence we just don't know. But more from the CBS News thing. Crowds shrink at St. Peter's Square as Italy coronavirus cases surge. There's a rumor going around that the Pope might have this. Lord knows, I hope that's not the case. Ecuador reports 5 new cases. Skip over that. Alex Azar doing politics, all this stuff. Number of countries rises to 64. We could go on and on. Okay, so what do we have? Let's give you some secondary news of things that are going to happen around this. The disease is terrible, but we're going to hit these soft. All of the articles, as always, are posted on coronaviruscentral.net. Make sure you bookmark the site. We use that site if this gets shut down for any reason, because we are criticizing people who don't like to be criticized, that will be available to you. If they take that down, we will be on Telegram, t.me/coronaviruscentral. We're on Facebook at Coronavirus Central. We're on Twitter at CoronavirusCast, and I will go to whatever platforms I need. If I need to go to Gab, to obscure platforms you haven't heard of, BitChute, DLive, we will find the way. We will get that information to you. The Telegram has been the foundation of this. Look, as I told you guys, I've done some things politically. I know where, there are free speech platforms and where there are not. We're going to continue free speech for the world. And for people in other countries, we recommend, there's a number of global communities on Telegram already devoted to coronavirus in different languages. I'm a member of the French and Spanish language groups. We've been sharing a lot of information. This open source collaborative information sharing is such a powerful model. Let's see a lot more of it. Let's take our brain power and devote it to that instead of this. And let's put a pause on it. The New York Stock Exchange might be thinking that way. dailymail.co.uk. Report by Ralph R. Ortega on the 28th of February. New York Stock Exchange considers shutting trading floor amid coronavirus fears as Wall Street firms tell workers to prepare to work from home. Yeah, that's coming, and that's coming this week. If they allow the NYSE to open today, it's going to get pummeled yet again. It's about 7:30. The market opens in an hour 30. This just talks about them preparing for it amidst panic. Got to do it. I understand that. We have another article, which I'm going to share more for public interest. How 2 uniquely American issues can make the coronavirus worse. This is by Denitsa Setkova, date of March 1st, 2020. So she writes, the spread of coronavirus outbreak may be particularly swift in the U.S. thanks to the nation's cost-sharing health insurance models and legions of workers without paid sick leave. So she's thinking that tremendous economic need to go into work. This is true. So many people have reached out to this podcast saying, Tom, I got to pay my bills. I got to go to work. I got to do these things. I'm not telling you not to do that. I understand those choices. You have to make the evaluation between the dangers and risks involved based on your area, news and that, and the projections that are out there. If you are in a city that is recognized as a highly contagious zone at this point, and I will offer my coronavirus central assessment of what cities I would include at an absolute minimum in that list. Keep in mind there are others. I am missing some, but ones I would be uncomfortable going out in myself and where I would stay in under any circumstances. In Canada, I would include the cities of Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, and I've heard quite a bit about potentially Edmonton. That's one you're going to want to keep an eye on. In the United States, we're talking about Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, San Diego. We know there was an early case in Phoenix. Let's put that on the list. A lot of rumors out of Honolulu. We've seen cases in Japan come out where they traveled heavily in Maui and Oahu. I think you're going to have cases there. There was an early case in Phoenix. That's probably a problem city. San Antonio, we've talked about. A lot of information coming out of Houston suggesting that something might be going on there. Omaha, Nebraska is going to be a concern. Atlanta, Georgia, the CDC's there. Do you trust them? I don't. Be careful. Tampa, Florida, now we have cases out of there. Washington, D.C., a lot of people are going to be flying in and out of Washington at all times. That's going to be a problem. Chicago, Illinois, we know there's issues there. New York, Providence, Rhode Island, big cluster forming there. And I think Boston, Massachusetts, we saw an early case in Mass. I think there's going to be issues there. Those are the cities that I currently have under, and Spokane, Washington as well. Because there were a lot of people being treated there. Those are the places I would be most worried about. If you live in those areas, you are getting a coronavirus central, elevated, stay the hell home alert, that you are going to be taking much greater risks if you are in those areas or in near environments around those. If you are not in those areas, now is the time, or if you are in those areas, and you can leave, get out of there, go to a place of lower population density if you can do so. If you cannot, make sure you are prepared to stay in place for an extended length of time. So important. We've talked about this air filtration. You want to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to this. If you have to stay at home and watch the news, we'll talk about it together. We're here. We'll cover it. It's what we have to do. There is a great article Let's continue this. So tremendous economic need to go to work. That literally, and this is one of the sad things about this COVID outbreak, is the poorest people are going to be the hardest hurt because they're going to have to go. They live paycheck to paycheck. We reported that Hong Kong went out there and they went ahead and they provided money to individuals and families to survive. We are calling right now, and listen, I'm Republican, right? I'm telling you, the government in the United States, rather than bailing out a whole bunch of money to firms, which they might need to do, or dumping money into the market, the government needs to figure out a way right now, not 10 days from now, not 10 minutes from now, to get money in people's hands if need to be, if through EBT systems, whatever, if you want to do this so that people can get extra food stocks, or work with Amazon, Whole Foods, Walmart, big suppliers to move goods as an emergency basis to individuals who have food scarcity and have means for sending that around. This is going to be so important. We talked about that last week. I even more so now, because people are going to have to stay in place, and people are not ready for it because the government has chosen not to. They've worked from optimistic assumptions instead of realistic ones, and I think that that's something that those of us who are left are going to look at very differently. And I guarantee you, I'm going to be screaming about it up here from Maine in my cabin, and we're definitely going to be talking about this. And two problems they talk about is the number of people saying more than 2 in 5 workers don't get paid sick days, and the number of people, they say about a quarter of the wage distribution are basically stuck going to work. If you're in that position, man, I'm going to be praying for you. Hopefully you can get some protection for yourself. Do what you can as best you can. You understand the risks for you and your family. Keep in mind they can't kick you out if there's no one to grab you. Okay, think twice about going to the doctor. 7% or 27.5% million U.S. Americans lacked medical insurance. I think that is probably something that looks more of a problem here at the beginning, but will prove less of a problem at the end, because you know who goes to hospitals? Sick people. If you have anything other than the most severe illnesses, I would highly recommend at this point to stop the spread of the disease that you do not go to medical facilities, as those will be central points from which this will spread, until such time as protective measures are taken and employed universally across all aspects of the medical profession to protect people. One person, as we've seen, can infect so many others. We've seen cases where, like in the South Korean case, where one person going to a church potentially led to hundreds of cases directly evolved from that. And these things we should expect. So what can we do against this? There's an article on 538.com, February 28th, 2020. Quarantines won't save us from coronavirus. This is by Maggie Kurth. She's talking about historical presentation of what quarantines do, how they used to do 30-day quarantines, and the suggestion is, does it work, does it not work? The evidence is mixed. At the beginning, with good case tracking, it has value. It can certainly reduce the transmission rate at the cost of losing a lot of economic growth. It provides resources that people really need. The government would have a lot of problems enacting a quarantine, and they talk about this in here, that the leaky nature of quarantines in this article is that people who are not prepared to be quarantined will break quarantine. People who do not believe in the quarantines will break quarantines. And I think there's ample evidence extant in the public sphere that that's going to happen in big numbers. And the question is, if you quarantine everywhere, who's going to enforce it? So at this point, that I think the government will try quarantines. I hope they're effective. I think they're doing it because government's going to have to do something. People are going to demand it, and they're going to choose to do more rather than less, even though I don't know how valuable it is. If it can reduce case spread, that is valuable. I hope the government is putting more effort into diagnostic development and looking to figure out not just testing, but ways to implement drug production and cures. If I was in charge, and I've thought about these sorts of things before, I would be putting all my efforts as the United States government into ramping up industrial production capacity of medicines, medical-related pharmaceutical components, APIs, and protective gear, as well as food production and food distribution. Those are the areas we absolutely need to focus on now. All the rest of it doesn't matter. Some of it matters, obviously, but not really, not the same way. So you can look at this. It'll go through detail. What it says is they don't know, but it probably isn't going to help that much. Nonetheless, expect the government to do it. And I would say, based on the rumors we're hearing, Seattle and San Francisco, you're first on deck. I put up an article here. I'm just going to share it. It's about the history of vaccines. I wanted to put it out there for you. Explains the different processes just to show you that you know how long it takes. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. And it's going to take a while to get out there with solutions that actually can cure this. If it can be done, not very confident it can be for a lot of different reasons. We talked about that today. You guys know what I think about all that. And that, here at 2 hours, 2 minutes, concludes your Monday edition of Coronavirus Central. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski. I'm going to go have it's 7:42 a.m. is a great time for a scotch. Absolutely. We're going to go ahead and do that here. And I'm going to try to fight with my computer to get this uploaded so you guys have this by 9 a.m. It does not like big files, but this is too important and we will get it out there. So some thoughts to each of you. One thing to take a little bit of hope in the short term is we are going to have a little bit of time on this because some of us are pretty healthy. A lot of us are. And that we, even though we have very widespread, we have seen thus far in the short term, which I hesitate to say, may change rapidly, is that there's probably a lot more people who have this already, especially in the United States, Europe, East Asia, and I think, throughout the Middle East as well. Maybe not so much in Latin America and Africa. We just don't know. There's so many reasons why it would be hard to tell that. It seems probable, but it's possible it's not. It's going to be a situation where we're going to have to be in it. We're going to have to work hard for a cure. We're going to have to rush. That's why they banned Plague Inc. in China. They don't want people doing the math of it. If you've never played it, by the way, if you're one of those schadenfreude people who needs relaxation by seeing and understanding it, go download Plague Inc., play the game, and you'll understand why people like me were freaking out about a disease that didn't look that bad. It's because it didn't look that bad that it was so scary, because it was able to spread. And now this thing is a pandemic. And if the WHO still refuses to call it a pandemic, man, I don't know what you can do. Those people should, if they weren't a nation, I would say charge them with treason. But unfortunately, they're international, and that's the problem. This is an international problem. The solution has to be international. We got to cross language barriers, and I was saying ethnic barriers and ideological barriers, honestly, which is harder in a lot of ways. Every country's going to get screwed by this. The economy is going to get pummeled. There's no way around it because the panic that exists is not unfounded. Fear is a rational emotion to a situation beyond your control, and it is a learned mechanism that we have that helps keep us alive. So if you're afraid while you're listening to this, I am afraid with you. That's perfectly fine. And I'm not, I'm playing armchair psychologist here at 7:45 in the morning here with a snifter. But what I'm thinking is that we have to approach this rationally and okay, we're in Saw now, maybe. It might be like that movie. How do we get out? What do we lose? And let's be honest, into the United States government, the CDC in particular, and the Trump administration, be honest with the people about the things you know, the things you don't know, and the risks at hand. I understand there may have been pressure to be quiet about things because you were trying to get economic resources in place. I hope you had a plan. We know about the military pandemic plans. We know the DOD was doing some things. I hope you have something in place. If you don't, admit it. Let's go forward. We all have to work on the solutions. There'll be time for recriminations later for the survivors of this. Let's hope it's not that bad. Let's hope these are manageable conditions. Let's hope for the best in this. But let's prepare for the worst. That's what we do as Coronavirus Central. We are here every weekday morning. I usually start my show around 6 or 7. I don't sleep very much anymore. Who can blame me, right? I will do a show on YouTube tonight. We'll put a link at Coronavirus Central. It will be a live show. I will attempt to answer your questions. I don't know all the answers you want to know. There's also, I'm seeing some things starting to hint, we'll probably talk about this tomorrow or the next day, that maybe it does get into pets, and that is just more great news. But protect yourself, protect your loved one, protect your dog, protect who you can, man, and protect yourself. Ultimately, look, we survived because we have instincts. Your instincts are probably going to be a better guide to you than your research at this point. Act intelligently. Don't panic. Do prepare. Heavenly Father, we just ask that you remove and lift this horrible plague from us and give us the wisdom to overcome our own folly of either allowing this to spread or creating such a horrible thing that we may find peace and tranquility for all men and hopefully build a better kingdom in the future under your name. And my prayers personally go to all the sick, the afflicted, and to the first care responders. For you guys, I have a special message. I've had a number of people contact me, surgeons, doctors, nurses, all sharing information. If your medical service site will not give you the protection you need, Form collectively, talk to your coworkers, strike if you have to, stop the care until you can protect yourselves, because you're protecting no one if you get sick. We need you. We love you. We're proud of you. We're going to back you. And this show, we're just going to keep on going, man. And God bless you all. I'll be with you tomorrow. This is Tom Kaczynski. See you on YouTube tonight at 7 p.m. tomorrow morning. And this is Coronavirus Central.